forwarding the slides here.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees.
The report we're going to be talking about today covers legislation in all 50 states and the District of Columbia during the time period of 2012 to 2014. Some states that may have already have had robust and developed local food programs prior to 2012 may not be included in the report, so please do not take offense. And we would be remiss if we didn't once again thank the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future for the support to complete this report and build upon our expertise and complement our previous work on these issues. So without further ado, let's dive in. Next slide, please. So here's kind of some of the major findings from the report. State legislatures have many roles to play in supporting local and regional food systems, including funding, staffing, cross-agency collaboration, and creation of new programs. So here are the major trends we noted from the 2012 through the 2014 legislative session time period we examined for this report. The report also included a few additional topics that you can read more about. We also highlighted several different state and topical case studies in each section, so please, we do encourage you to check it out more carefully and read and let us know what you think. The topics in bold are ones we saw particular or kind of increased legislative action compared to in the past, and which we will focus on today. Some of these trends have seen a lot of activity the past few years, like food hubs and urban agriculture, while others, such as farm to school, have enjoyed kind of a good, consistent amount of state interest and support since the early 2000s. Some states, such as Massachusetts, have created kind of multifaceted programs focusing on many aspects of the food system, such as grocery retail development and access, farmers markets, and food hubs. We'll hear from Benita, Christina, and Rose about the campaign there in Massachusetts to create and implement the Massachusetts Food Trust Program and other initiatives later in the webinar. Ann and Karen, could we run our second question now?
Should be yes.
So what is your oh, sorry.
Go ahead, keep going.
What is your primary interest in local food systems? And this is a question in which you can put more than one answer. Please select all that applies, supporting consumers with access, supporting producers, policymaking at the state or local level, policymaking at the federal level, academia, or research.
You guys are awesome. We're at 3 more seconds to vote. All right, we've got 95% of the vote locked in. And it looks like the responses are 76% supporting consumers with access, 66% supporting producers, 67% policy making at the state and local level, 31% policy making at the federal level, and 24% academia or research.
Thanks everyone for all the responses. Next we're going to talk about food hubs. And so food hubs are a fairly new, here next slide, sorry. Okay. Food hubs are a fairly new concept with great growth in recent years, and they actually help both producers and consumers with gain access to local and healthy foods. There's been a great increase in recent years, and according to the National Food Hub Survey in 2013, 73% of food hubs were in metro counties. And so it's really that urban, oh, go back one slide, urban area which can also both allow producers to reach consumers as well, since there's a lot of interest on this webinar and access to consumers. In a single facility, food hubs host a wide range of services for producers and often house multiple aspects of the supply chain of a local food system. If you know of a food hub in your state, feel free to share in the chat box any examples that you may have come across. Beyond the building or space itself, services can support producers in marketing, distribution, storage, processing, training, and other services. The space can also facilitate direct access to consumers as well as institutional buyers such as hospitals, restaurants, or other businesses. Legislatures have supported food hubs through funding. For example, Maryland appropriated funds in 2014 for the Baltimore Food Hub. Ohio also allocated funds to create a food hub which involved a joint use agreement with the state university and a nonprofit which works with people with developmental disabilities. We expect legislators to take more interest in food hubs in the next few years as lawmakers and stakeholders learn more about the role that food hubs can play in helping smaller producers grow their businesses and market reach. Next slide. Another way that communities can access healthy food is by growing their own, so community gardens or other urban agricultural initiatives. Gardening has changed a lot since the Victory Gardens from World War II, World War I, and states play varying roles in supporting community gardens and other urban agricultural initiatives. States such as Tennessee have improved upon this strong and rich history of gardening with legislative initiatives, and there's a case study in our report that you may want to check out. Tennessee, during 2012 to 2014, passed several pieces of legislation that amended their Community Gardening Act of 1977. So again, building upon a rich history of gardening in the state. Tennessee, along with 3 other states, New Jersey, New York, and West Virginia, has supported the development of community gardens for more diverse populations. So they focus on elderly populations, immigrants, low-income communities, and the youth. State legislation can really have a lasting impact by developing community gardens through access to land, allowing the sale, donation, and consumption of produce, which we saw in Tennessee as well, and targeting certain populations, again, such as immigrant groups or the elderly. While community gardens could be included in the definition of urban agriculture, and for many states it is part of their urban agricultural program, we also highlighted other urban agricultural initiatives in the report. Next slide. The 2 states with urban agricultural incentive zones include California and Missouri. Both the legislatures in these states recently took innovative steps towards revitalizing urban areas with local food production. If you have me from California or Missouri, feel free to share in the chat box if you've seen these zones in your state as well. So both states created incentives to use blighted and underutilized vacant private land to grow produce or raise animals. Missouri's definition also allows for vending and processing in these zones, while California focuses on growing produce and raising animals. In Missouri, any person or organization may submit an application to a municipality to develop a zone on a blighted area of land. Once established in Missouri, property taxes may not be assessed on any of these zones for 25 years, except an amount no greater than the amount due the year before the zone was designated. Zones must pay wholesale water rates and pay 50% of the standard cost to hook into the water source. All local sales tax revenues from the sale of products sold in the zone minus 1% to the Department of Revenue must be deposited into a newly created fund. School districts may apply for these funds to develop curriculum on urban farming practices under the guidance of the University of Missouri and a certified instructor. So again, connecting urban agriculture to training for youth at the university level. California also enacted similar legislation to Missouri in 2013. This legislation authorized cities and counties to enter into agricultural land preservation contracts with landowners who agree to restrict the use of their land for a minimum of 5 years, in exchange for the land under contract being assessed at the lower rate based on the average per acre value of irrigated cropland in the state. The bill sponsor, Assemblymember Phil Ting, who's in this photo here, argued that many properties in urban areas lie underdeveloped for many years and can blight the surrounding neighborhood. His bill sought to create an incentive for the owners of these properties to use their properties for urban agriculture and create green space and a local food source for communities. So again, providing access to consumers as well as increasing opportunities for producers. So there you go, addressing economic development and access to healthy foods in urban areas with an innovative idea. We look forward to seeing how California and Missouri have moved forward with these pieces of legislation. Again, feel free to share in the chat box. We're aware that San Francisco has moved forward and are looking at other cities and counties that may be implementing this. Next slide.
So farm-to-school programs have been growing in popularity since the early 2000s and continue to see a good amount of legislative interest and support, which is perhaps not surprising considering the most recent USDA farm-to-school census found over 5,000 school districts and almost 43,000 schools across the country participate in farm-to-school activities in some way. State support varies widely, but typically focuses on the 5 listed components in this slide. Activity in the 2012 to 2014 period particularly centered on 2 areas, creating state agency staffing, programming, and grant funding to support farm-to-school, and efforts to create school gardens, which can help source produce for school lunch trays, as well as teach students about food production. One example, in 2014, Missouri created a state farm-to-school program within the Department of Agriculture with additional support from the Departments of Health and Senior Services and Elementary and Secondary Education, respectively. They also authorized a grant program that focuses on awards to small businesses and agricultural producers that purchase and or process locally grown agricultural products and primarily market to schools. The first 3 grants were awarded to a dairy producer, a university, and a hydroponic farmer to increase their ability to produce or purchase local foods. With regards to school gardens, 5 states, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and West Virginia, passed laws between 2012 and 2014 that addressed or supported school gardens or linking schools with community gardens in some manner. New Jersey's law, for example, affirms that a school district can serve students' produce from a community garden so long as the soil and water sources have been tested for contaminants and the produce has been handled, stored, transported, and prepared in accordance with relative laws and requirements. Next slide, please. Kind of a similar story with farmers markets. We've seen they're more ubiquitous now, and there's also been kind of consistent kind of state legislative action for quite a while. We saw that continue in the 2012 to 2014 time period. Their profile has been kind of raised amongst state lawmakers as an outlet to provide healthy local food and increase access for underserved populations. The number of farmers markets in the U.S. has more than quadrupled since 1994. States have continued to focus on how to ensure public assistance recipients can buy food at a farmer's market with their food stamp, or now called SNAP, benefits. As many of you probably know, they use SNAP recipients use electric benefit transfer, or EBT cards, which are similar to credit cards to purchase food. Many farmers markets don't have the necessary EBT terminals and associated kind of equipment and wireless access needed to process these cards. 8 states, Connecticut, Louisiana, Missouri, New Jersey, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and West Virginia, passed legislation supporting or expanding the ability to use SNAP, WIC, and seniors nutrition program benefits at farmers markets. For example, Vermont appropriated funds that included grants enabling acceptance of EBT funds at farmers markets. One burgeoning idea that has received support and interest from the USDA and groups such as Wholesome Wave is the idea of providing financial incentives to those purchasing at farmers markets to buy more fresh produce. One school of thought, and I think they're obviously coming together, is that one problem is access, the other is affordability. So after a number of attempts by state legislatures, California, Missouri, and New Mexico all have created state bonus bucks programs to provide incentive matches for SNAP recipients to purchase fresh produce bought at farmers markets in either 2015 or 2016. New Mexico created a Double Up Food Bucks program, which provides financial incentives for people to buy fresh and healthy foods by doubling the value of federal nutrition assistance used at participating markets. New Mexico became the first state to legislatively appropriate funds for such a program with $400,000 in 2015. I would encourage you to reach out to Pam Roy at Farm to Table in New Mexico, and she can give you more details on that. To my knowledge, California have not yet appropriated funds for their programs. I'd be interested if anyone had any updated information to the contrary. Karen and Ann, can you flash question number 3 for us now? So which food systems policy area is most applicable for your work? Please select all that apply. Food hubs, urban agriculture, community gardens, farm to school, farmers markets, and food retail. It'll be interesting to see how much this syncs up with what we're kind of seeing legislatively, and may give us a little bit of an idea of what we will see in the future.
Doug and Mindy, before we close the poll, we've been getting a lot of questions about where people can find bill language that you've been talking about. So do you want to talk about the links in the reports of where they can find the language of bills?
Yeah, so at the end of each of the sections, so the topical sections that were on an earlier slide, local food systems, urban ag, community gardens, at the end of each of those, we've provided bill summaries, and then each of the bills are linked to the actual legislation from the state legislature.
And you know, there's the grain of salt that the caveat that those links sometimes do not last forever. We did link to the bill language rather than the statutes. There's some advantages to that. Oftentimes a bill will be amending a number of statutes or creating a whole new statute. So we find that sometimes to really get a record of what a particular piece of legislation did, it's better just to link to the bill. So take a look there and feel free to reach out if you have difficulty accessing any information.
All right, we closed the poll and figured out how to share results.
Wow, that's pretty impressive to see that it's so even. I think it's good for us to know, as we said, kind of food hubs is kind of an emerging area, something that maybe those that work in that are producers or distributors probably think, this has been around forever, but thinking about it in terms of state legislation, it's good and interesting to see that there's a good amount of activity going on there. And I think with the farmers markets and farm to school, to see that that's the areas where there's the most work going on, that's not surprising because that's reflected in state legislation as well. And those are things that I think probably have the most kind of just like basic knowledge among the general public.
So that's all we had about the report, but I just wanted to add in 2 quick slides. So the next map. NCSL, of course, has many other programs. We have an elections and campaign program that is tracking the legislative races this year. And so feel free to check out NCSL State Vote 2016 here. Next slide. But I thought with the election coming up, this might be of interest to individuals on the webinar. Here's just one map of the breakdown of state legislatures. Republicans control 67 legislative chambers and Democrats control 31. We look at a total of 99 legislative chambers because Nebraska is unicameral and nonpartisan. And out of all these legislative seats, there's 80% that are up on the ballot and contested this year. Next slide. There's 18 chambers that our staff have identified as kind of battleground states to watch this year, including Colorado, Iowa, Nevada, Washington, and West Virginia that all have Senate chambers that could shift with party control with just 1 seat change. So just really quickly, feel free to check out more information on our website. There's a lot of great analysis, and we update it all election night long and the week afterwards. So just wanted to add that extra bonus for folks on the webinar. And then I think we just have one more slide with NCSL resources. And feel free to reach out, check out our website. We have many other publications and a blog and a magazine as well. Doug, did you have?
No, I think that's it. One thing I guess we were remiss in adding in here that just our email addresses are respectively, is it on next slide?
Yeah, on the last slide.
If you go to the last slide, it has our email addresses, and you can feel free to reach out to us. But otherwise, thank you very much once again for the opportunity, CLF team, and looking forward to hearing the updates from Massachusetts and getting some questions and having some discussion with the attendees.
Thanks, Doug and Mindy. Benita Elke, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future for this platform. As Karen mentioned earlier, I've been working with the Massachusetts Food Policy Council since it started in 2010, and prior to that I was the department liaison to an advocacy group whose efforts led to the legislation that formed the Massachusetts Food Policy Council. So in these next moments, I'll share information about the Massachusetts Food Policy Council, the Mass Local Food Action Plan, and the connections to the Mass Food Trust and the Mass Food Ventures legislation. Next slide, please. So the Mass Food Policy Council supports the Food Trust and the Food Venture legislation, but more broadly, it supports mass food systems in general. After many years of advocacy, Massachusetts General Law was amended to create a 17-member Food Policy Council to develop recommendations to advance food systems for the Commonwealth and to increase production, sales, and consumption of Massachusetts-grown goods. And the purpose is to develop and promote programs that develop healthy Massachusetts-grown foods to Massachusetts residents. Next slide. These bullets are additional purposes of the Massachusetts Food Policy Council. And you'll see some parallels between these bullets and the legislative language of the programs that you'll be hearing about later. Several topics that are listed in the legislation are mirrored in the Food Trust and the Food Venture legislation. So for example, looking at increased state purchasing for schools, looking at increased institutional purchases to make healthy foods more affordable, looking at health issues relating to mass-grown foods and the availability in communities with public health challenges, looking at environmental protection in terms of water, especially for production, and then looking at economic development in terms of the continued economic viability of local food production. Next slide, please. Again, this is from the legislation that established the Food Policy Council, that the recommendations, which at the very least need to be made to the general court through an annual report, can address these bullet items. Again, you'll see there's a lot of agency collaboration opportunity, partnerships, focus on topics relating to regulatory issues and topics relating to legislative issues. Next slide, please. So the Food Policy Council includes legislators, industry reps across wide sections of the mass food system, and 6 state agency members. So there's broad representation and perspectives. Next slide, please. So this lets you know specifically who the industry sector representatives are, including growers, food processors, consumer marketing, community health, local health department, and Massachusetts actually has 351 municipalities who can be more conservative than the State Department of Public Health in terms of their regulatory food code enforcement and then food safety representation. And next slide. There's 6 agencies that are represented on the Massachusetts Food Policy Council, and you can see them, and that they include Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, Economic Development, Mass Department of Public Health, Elementary and Secondary Education, Environmental Protection, Transitional Assistance, and there is draft legislation to add an agency representative from the Division of Marine Fisheries, because it's really hard to talk about the food system in Massachusetts without talking about fisheries. Next slide. And then there's 4 legislative representatives, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, and they really provide the Food Policy Council with a realistic perspective on the process at the State House and what opportunities there are in relation to the legislative process. Next slide, please. So the statewide plan that I'll mention coming up includes language to support the Food Trust and the Food Ventures program. And the Mass Food Policy Council Advisory Committee played an important role in developing the statewide plan. So in the legislation, there is language that talks about the Food Policy Council having an advisory committee, that the committee is appointed by the Food Policy Council. The Food Policy Council members are appointed by the governor, so appointing the advisory committee members by the council makes it pretty straightforward. They're not appointed by the governor. All the meetings are open to the public. They're subject to the open meeting laws. It adds a lot of transparency to the process, and the website for the Food Policy Council for Massachusetts is listed as the final bullet on the slide. Next slide, please. This shows the broad representation of the Mass Food Policy Council members that are represented. Again, it's really, the objective is to have a wide industry focus to be able to represent all components of the food system. So UMass Amherst is our partner in terms of academia. We also have another opportunity for academia with the School of Nutrition or Public Health, and then many other members. And the Food Policy Council can also add members depending on what topic they're interested in getting more information about. Next slide, please. So the Food Policy Council was formed in 2010, and then in 2011, the Food Trust from Philadelphia, the Massachusetts Public Health Association, the Massachusetts Food Association, and the Boston Foundation convened a group that will be described later by the Mass Public Health Association called the Mass Grocery Task Force on Retail Access. And then the task force actually met with the Food Policy Council. And the idea was to really look at opportunities to collaborate or to identify issues of mutual interest. Next slide, please. And the Mass Food Policy Council looked at the recommendations from this task force and basically looked at broadening them so that instead of focusing specifically on supermarkets, the focus was on the whole food system. And there were 9 recommendations, and you'll just see a couple of them here. But the sections in red are what was added by the Food Policy Council Advisory Committee to include basically all components of the mass food system, including primary production, fisheries, processors, manufacturers, wholesale and retail components, including the supermarket industry, but not limited to the supermarket industry, and then focusing on healthy food topics. Recommendation 2 has some of the very same language. Next slide, please. And you can see on recommendation 3 and 4, again, a broader focus on the whole food system rather than just looking at retail for healthy food opportunities. Next slide, please. So the Massachusetts Food Policy Council was looking at the recommendations that they had broadened and really use that information as a catalyst to think about developing a comprehensive strategic plan for the whole state, for the whole food system, of which supermarket access would be one element. And then later that same year, the Food Policy Council moved forward with advice from the Food Policy Council Advisory Committee for a framework, including that the Food Policy Council be given fiduciary authority to hold and administer funds to be able to contract for services and oversee a strategic planning process, including an RFR for a facilitating entity. That legislation was actually passed to amend the Food Policy Council enabling statute to give authority to receive and expend state appropriated funds and then commingle them with funds from the philanthropic partners for the purpose of this statewide planning process. The RFR was released in August of 2013. Next slide, please. There were many responses to the RFR. There were 3 top contenders that presented to the Food Policy Council. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council was selected for the contract award for the development of a statewide strategic food system plan. And what is important in this plan is that there is a focus on local agriculture. There was an 18-month process that followed. There was wide engagement. There were over 1,500 individuals that were involved through working groups or through other advocacies to put this all together. And the plan was accepted by the Mass Food Policy Council in December 2015. So the action items in the Mass Local Food Action Plan help to build a framework for the 2 programs that you're going to hear more about, as well as build awareness and support. And there's a link for the Mass Local Food Action Plan on this slide. Next slide, please. So this is direct language from the Mass Local Food Action Plan, supporting legislation for a Massachusetts food trust for $10 million in public financing and additional funds to be raised. And this you'll hear about more, but the idea was to provide loans, grants, and technical assistance for new and healthy food retailers and local food enterprises in low and moderate income communities. Next slide, please. Language in the Mass Local Food Action Plan also strongly supports the Food Ventures program that you'll hear more about. And it's sprinkled throughout the plan, especially in sections relating to food access and to distribution. The program supports locally grown Massachusetts foods to improve access to healthy foods and stimulate economic activities in communities of low and moderate income, both urban and rural. And again, you'll be hearing more about that from Rose. Next slide, please. There were many partners and advocates, and if you're trying to sort of draw a straight line, it's actually impossible to draw a straight line for how this happened. Certainly, the action items in the local food plan built a framework for the programs, and the working groups also helped build awareness and support. Food Policy Council agency members, like the Department of Agriculture, Department of Public Health, cannot lobby, although each agency has a legislative liaison who has the opportunity to share language within the department and with subject experts for comment to provide back. But the Food Policy Council non-agency members are able to advocate for legislation. And if you think back to the charts that showed all the different members, actually of the 17 members, 11 are able to be involved in lobbying or advocacy for legislation. And it's very important to note the multifaceted approach, and that there were many individuals, organizations, and advocates that made the legislation possible. And I'm happy to address any questions separately, and my contact information is available here. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Benita. We're going to turn it over to Christina now.
Great, thank you so much for having me today. I'm Christina St. Cyr. As was said before, I'm the Coalition and Field Organizer with the Massachusetts Public Health Association, or MPHA. I know we all love our acronyms. Just for those who don't know, MPHA is a statewide public health advocacy organization. We're a leading affiliate of the American Public Health Association, and we really see ourselves as the champion for public health in the Commonwealth. And we're working to eliminate health inequities and also creating healthy communities for everyone in Massachusetts. So just a little background, my role here at MPHA over the last year and a half, I've really been focused on healthy food access and affordability issues, with my biggest role, which is in managing the campaign for the Massachusetts Food Trust Program, and that is what I'm here to talk about today. So first, I just wanted to start off with a little bit of the healthy food access landscape in Massachusetts. You could go to the next slide, please. So in Massachusetts, we have over 1 million residents, including over 300,000 kids who lack access to grocery stores and other healthy food retail, which ranks us close to last in the nation for grocery stores per capita. And as my colleagues will tell you, in Massachusetts, we don't like to be last in anything, so this is a problem for us. So we know that inequitable access to healthy food retail and businesses really has negative effects on Massachusetts residents. Many of our lower income urban and rural communities have both poor access to healthy food and also have disproportionate rates of diet-related disease. We also know that towns and neighborhoods without healthy food businesses often miss out on the economic benefits created by those businesses, such as jobs and local tax revenues. And then we also have, more than 20 years of research that shows us that access to nutritious foods can improve eating habits and can contribute to positive health outcomes, including things like decreased risk for obesity and increased fruit and vegetable consumption, which are all good things. So, there's some healthy food access issues in Massachusetts, so what are we doing to address this? One piece of the solution puzzle is that we created the Massachusetts Food Trust Program. And so what is this Food Trust Program? Benita did a great job earlier kind of introducing a little bit of the history that got us to this as well. But the purpose of the Mass Food Trust Program is really to establish a public-private partnership that increases access to affordable, healthy food options and also improves the economic opportunities for low and moderate income communities all across the state. And so this is really modeled on a proven national strategy, and the Food Trust would use public seed funds in order to spur significant private investment, drive economic growth, and also create strong local job opportunities, all while improving access to healthy food. So there's a kind of lengthy process before the Mass Food Trust was even established and launched. So I'm going to take us back briefly to 2010 and give you a little more information on what Benita was talking about, the Massachusetts Grocery Access Task Force. So the Food Trust Program was actually a recommendation of this Grocery Access Task Force, and they were a public-private partnership, which meant for about 2 years to tackle this problem of lack of access to healthy foods in grocery stores in Massachusetts. If you can just go back one slide real quick for me. So the task force conducted a study which found large swaths of urban and rural Massachusetts really lacked good access to grocery stores as well as other healthy food retailers. So you can see on the screen now there's a map, and I do apologize, I understand that this is getting a little dated. This was the map that was created during the Grocery Access Task Force convening, and so the data comes from 2010. But if you just look at those red splotches on the screen, it might not look like a lot, but it actually represents basically every major municipality in Massachusetts, as well as large swaths of rural Massachusetts. And those red splotches, I guess, are what represent the 1 million Massachusetts residents. So it might not look like a lot on the screen, but it actually is a good portion of our population that is affected by this lack of access. And so, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we know that grocery stores, access to grocery stores are linked to lower rates of things like obesity, diabetes, and other diet-related diseases. And we also know that many of these same communities that lack access to healthy foods are really struggling economically and lack job opportunities for local residents. So one of the several recommendations that came out of this Grocery Access Task Force was for the state to create a fresh food financing fund. And Benita was able to show you some of the recommendations that came out of the task force, and so I'll just briefly read this specific recommendation that really seeded the idea for the Food Trust program. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts should develop and seed a flexible financing program that provides grants, loans, and technical assistance to support the development, renovation, and expansion of supermarkets and other retailers selling healthy foods in underserved communities. Massachusetts should seek to leverage seed capital from the state with additional public and private investment through a public-private partnership. And that's pretty much exactly what we did. If you could go to the next slide. So MPHA has been working with a wide array of partners statewide for 2 years. So from when this report came out from the task force from about 2012 to 2014, before we were able to get the Massachusetts Food Trust established. So the program was established in law in 2014 in the Environmental Bond Bill. It's listed in the report as H4375, but we call it the Environmental Bond Bill. So MPHA and our many partners, we also worked really hard to make sure that this program wasn't solely focused on supermarkets and grocery stores, but that it really, as Benita said, aligned with the goals of the Food Policy Council, and that it was a flexible fund that could really support the needs of different communities, whatever those needs may be. I think in Massachusetts it really does look differently in every community. So the program was established in the Environmental Bond Bill, and it was placed at the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development, or AGD. And we really saw this as a good fit since the Food Trust is really, it's an economic development program, which is different for us public health advocates to say. But it's designed to leverage private capital and to lend to local businesses. So as it was written in the legislation, the Mass Food Trust program would provide loans and grants and technical assistance to support new and expanded healthy food retailers and local food enterprises, specifically in low and moderate income communities. And so this can include, you know, supermarkets and grocery stores, which are an important aspect of the program, but it's also, like I said, flexible and can support corner stores, farmers markets, mobile markets, indoor outdoor greenhouses, just a variety of projects to suit the needs of communities. So it's important to note that in this 2014 legislation, there was no funding directly attached to the program in the Environmental Bond Bill. And so really these last 2 years have been about getting dedicated funding for the Mass Food Trust so that we can get the program up and running and so that we can really realize the impact that it can have in communities across the Commonwealth. So the reason we're seeking public seed funds for this program is that we've seen this model be very successful in other states. New York and Pennsylvania have leveraged between $9 and $15 in private and federal funds for just every $1 of state seed funding. And we also know that, you know, better access to healthy food means more jobs, and increased access to food retail options can drive economic growth in communities. Just in Pennsylvania, for example, their Fresh Food Financing Initiative supported over 5,000 jobs throughout the state, which is really incredible. So you can see on the slide here, I just wanted to a little visual to kind of help everyone understand the financing model. So typically in programs like this and how it's set up in Massachusetts is that, the government provides some sort of seed funding for the program, oversees program implementation, but really the program is run out of a CDFI, a community development financial institution, which is, in my own words, like a mission-driven bank that does lending typically in communities that have not been invested in or disinvested in. And so CDFI has the ability to raise private capital, which is really what makes this an innovative and unique program, is that it can take the seed funding, raise private capital, raise additional federal funds, and then, loan out some of those funds and grant out those funds in communities in the form of the projects listed on the right, so the grocery stores, co-ops, et cetera. And so I'm just gonna, if we can go to the next slide, briefly bring you up to present day. We've had several really big wins recently. It's been a long process. The program itself got established in 2014, and the FY 2016 budget, which was last year, we're able to get some supportive language for the food trust, which was kind of, a nod in the right direction, but didn't provide us any funding. Over the course of this campaign, we've had over 120 legislators who have supported the food trust program, and we have over 100 different organizations statewide who have signed on in support, which is really great. But that leads us to this past year. In the FY 2017 operating budget, we were able to get $100,000 for the operating expenses of the Mass Food Trust program, which is really exciting for us. That is real hard money that can be used for the administrative costs of actually running the program and setting up program guidelines and whatnot, but it doesn't account for the capital costs that are needed to provide those loans and grants out to communities and businesses. So fortunately, we were also able to get a $6 million authorization in the economic development bill for the capital cost of the program, and this bill was signed into law by the governor on August 10th of 2016, so fairly recently, which is great. And, we've definitely made tremendous progress, but there's still a lot of work for us to do to make this program a reality. For those not familiar with how things work in Massachusetts, funding authorized in large bond bills like the one signed by the governor and also like the bill that established this program, it doesn't guarantee that the program will actually be launched or that those funds will be released. And so it's really up to us and our partners to ensure that this funding is released and that the program is launched and we're able to have a robust program. So, what's up next is we hope to continue to work with HED to get these funds released, to work with the Baker administration to get the $6 million in bond funds released in the next year, and ideally the FY 18 capital budget. To also work with the Food Policy Council, since the Food Trust program is one of the prominent recommendations within the local food action plan, so we hope to have their support in getting this program off the ground. And if you can just go to the next slide. I understand this is a lot of information, and I probably went over on time, but I'm happy to talk, answer any questions in the Q&A and offline for more details. And I just want to say, I know Rose, you'll be hearing from Rose about a very complementary grant program that focuses more specifically on local food, but I just think with both of these programs up and running, we'll be able to see a big impact in Massachusetts in regards to healthy food access in the next couple of years. So thank you.
Thanks, Christina. Rose, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, and I'm going to be quick with my slide instructions, just to FYI. I'm going to talk in really broad strokes because I know we're a little crunched for time. As you've heard, I am the coordinator for the Massachusetts Urban Agriculture Program. It's nearly 3 years old, and the brand new Massachusetts Food Venture Program, which is just a few months old. Both programs are aligned, have aligned priorities and are part of the state strategy to increase access and to strengthen our agricultural sector. Next slide. I'm going to touch on urban ag, again in broad strokes. The urban agriculture sector has really created a presence in several cities for more than a decade, and there's actually a few groups here who are a couple decades old, just entrepreneurs for nonprofits, growing tens of thousands of pounds of nutritious food within food insecure communities. thus making an impact on residents' health and well-being. You could say it's a hyper-local focus on our food economy as it addresses food access. And when I say access, I'm talking about physical and financial. And I also want to note that our program is specifically focused on commercial food production. Next slide. MDAR's Urban Ag program was designed to build community partnerships and promote viable farming methods within city limits and to support economic enterprises and job training opportunities, as well as addressing social issues. Next. And how it's related to the local food plan. Well, in keeping with the commitment to work towards a more comprehensive, robust, and sustainable food system with a focus on our cities and vulnerable communities, the Urban Ag program, following an initial pilot project, was launched in January 2014, one of the nation's first statewide funded urban farming initiatives. It was a successful pilot project, and because of the demand of constituents, that they paved the way for the legislation for the program. It was subsequently authorized and funded in the environmental bond bill. Next slide. We're in our third year of funding. The state has invested $1.6 million thus far, and nearly 50 commercial projects have been funded. The agriculture program has shown that targeted investments help to address some of the challenges facing farmers in our cities. Next slide. And some of those problems are like suitable land, access to it, nutrient-poor soils, high startup costs, lack of farming and business training. But we're happy to report that the enterprises that have received funding from our agency through the Urban Ag program have expanded their production and have strengthened their viability and impact, while creating many more market access points for residents across the state and gateway cities. Next slide. Get into the Mass Food Ventures program. It's a significant investment to further the Commonwealth's commitment for a more sustainable and viable food system for all of our state's residents. It was created through the great advocacy and collaborative efforts of community, municipal, and state leaders, as well as our legislative partners. Next slide. The Food Ventures program was authorized through legislation in the environmental bond bill. It was funded for the next 2 years at $1 million a year, but the department, our agency, has budgeted for $4 million for our planning purposes. Next slide. Again, the overall goal of the Massachusetts Food Venture Program is to increase access to healthy, affordable local food options and improve economic opportunities. It will provide reimbursable grants up to $250,000 for food ventures sited in or near communities of low or moderate income, including gateway cities and rural communities. Next slide. It's going to help implement some of the objectives identified in the Massachusetts Local Food Action Plan. It's providing financial support to local food entrepreneurs, agricultural producers, and to help improve access, again, to Massachusetts grown, harvested, or caught food products, as well as promoting job creation. The success of the program is going to be through partnerships and leveraging financing between local agricultural enterprises and public-private entities. Next slide. Key investments will be in areas such as food processing, infrastructure, food hubs, mobile markets, food commissaries, improved distribution centers and systems, retail and market strategies that are going to improve that access to food produced in Massachusetts. Next slide. And as was mentioned earlier, the Food Trust differs from the Mass Food Venture Program because it's really based on a partnership with a community development financial institution. The Food Trust program is going to provide grants as well as loans and business and technical assistance, as Kristen stated. The Food Venture program is purely a reimbursable grant program. Next slide. What is at the core of both of these programs is a broad strategy for a comprehensive local food economy. The programs are aligned with the same goals. The Massachusetts Food Venture program has a strong focus on our producers and practitioners, making sure that our farmers, growers, fishermen, and women are a central component and that they are really key to the strategy to improve access and stimulate economic activity and opportunities. Next slide. So that said, we're really excited about the implementation of the first round of projects. Grantees will soon learn about their funding awards, which is why I really can't go into detail or specifics because they don't even know they've won yet. So we're that early into this program. We're gauging the success so far because the amount of proposals that we've received, the amount of interest from organizations inquiring about the program, and then assessing that their ability to get the shovels in the ground. They're not there yet. So several have determined that they will be applying for next year, which means that we'll have a very strong pool of enterprises that will be applying for that FY18 round. Next slide. So as we implement the program, we know that success is going to be due to a sound business plan, multiple partners, especially for the large-scale projects, community input, legislative support, research, and the assessment of the needs of those identified communities. And of course, capital, capital, capital. And it's all to build a network of enhanced and new enterprises that will help to meet the priorities of the local food action plan. Next slide. And as everyone else is made themselves available, so will I, and happy to be part of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose, and thank you all for presenting. That was a great presentation and overview of what's happening nationally at the state level with food systems legislation, and then great case study on the complexities of the environmental bond bill and its relationship to the local food plan in Massachusetts. So thank you all. We have 15 minutes for questions, and so we're going to start. We'll facilitate the questions for our panelists to respond to. We had several questions about impact of state legislation, one on urban agriculture, and then one particularly around the institutionalization of positions with state agencies. So Mindy or Doug, if you have any insights into kind of what the impact is at a state level when you create a position from the report or what you heard talking to folks, or Rose and Benita, if you have any insights about what happens when you make food systems a position within a state agency.
Yeah, this is Doug. I would maybe defer to Rose first to answer that question, since she's actually doing what's being asked, and then we can weigh in with some insight.
Okay, and can you clarify the question, Karen? I missed the first part.
Sure. Just wanting to know kind of how, when you institutionalize a position within a state agency, how that impacts or changes the dynamics of how food systems is thought about within your agency, what changes in the department within your state, kind of how it's had an impact within Massachusetts, since you work on urban agriculture, and we know that Benita works with the Food Policy Council through the state agency as well.
Great. Well, the reason that it works is because of partnerships. It's because of our in Massachusetts, we have just so many great coalitions regarding food systems, and our urban agriculture sector, as I mentioned earlier, has just really exploded. And having it here at the Department of Agriculture and introducing it, amongst the traditional agriculture work and focus, it took I have to say, it took a minute to really get some traction. But once people saw the impacts, once they were able to visit these enterprises to see the impact and the reach of the within the communities and the different access points and the job creation and the training, it just really was able to sell the story of urban ag. I think that we're in our third year now, and one of the projects I have ahead now is to collect that data to really show where what is the outcome of the money invested. We've 1.6 million in so far. So what will the state have to show for that investment? And so that report will be coming out at the beginning of next year. And I think that it'll show that we have a few dozen organizations around the state that are making quite an impact with the work that they're doing in about 8 different cities.
And this is Benita. I would say my perspective is that there's many food policy councils that are not housed within the state system, that we're actually in a minority compared to other food policy councils, being governor appointed and following the open meeting laws. And there was a lot of debate and discussion about the pros and cons prior to the formation. And in the end, there was a strong sentiment that the gravitas of a governor-appointed agency with official agency representatives who are in good seats to really be change makers, and then commingled with the industry representatives would be a template of a group that could move forward to affect the Massachusetts food system. I would say critics might talk about the open meeting law requirements and how it can make a process slow down, but the intent is to have 100% transparency. The other legislation also required that Mass Department of Ag Resources provide administrative support for the Food Policy Council, and there wasn't additional funding, so it was a mandate that the Department of Ag Resources needed to make happen without additional resources. So that could be an advantage of having a sort of state system, in that you can take advantage of existing staff and look at how support for a food policy council or for specific programs can fit in and enhance existing priorities with the agency to be able to meet our mission statement and our objectives.
Great. Thank you. Doug, did you want to add to the question?
I think that's more, they probably have better insight on that. I guess I would say the institutionalization within a state agency, I guess from my experience and looking at looking at what bills have been passed, just because you pass a bill and it becomes a law doesn't really mean that it always happens. There has to be political leadership and there has to be support within the agency in order for a staff position to really kind of take a hold and have the kind of requisite kind of resources and kind of time needed to actually do the duties that are asked. So it very much goes beyond the bill, just from the experiences of the different folks we've talked with.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. We had an additional question to the one about the institutionalization of a staff position for Benita and Rose. Do you see opportunities to share the model that the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources is using with other peer ag departments and how they can start to institutionalize some food systems work?
I would say that there is a lot of good networking and connection for food systems work in general, and that within New England we work very collaboratively through Food Solutions New England, and a great partnership with state agencies and with the philanthropic community who has been very interested in this subject. Vermont has the most longevity, and each state is different based on the resources and the strengths that they have. So I would say New England works very closely and often is communicating on approaches to food systems development and identifying priorities, implementing priorities, but each state is quite different. And again, it's based on the state government, it's based on the advocates and many other resources. So yeah, but it's very interesting.
I would say that in Massachusetts regarding urban agriculture, there are many opportunities. It's multi-sector, multi-layered. When you look at universities, for nonprofit, sister agencies, there is a great interest, and it hasn't waned at all, which is really exciting to me, regarding urban ag and, thinking about innovations, folks coming together to, work on the issue of having a very sustainable model that doesn't depend on grants or fundraising, which is something that, we work and continue to work to address. But yeah, we are very plentiful with opportunities to share information and to speak about urban ag here in Massachusetts.
And one other point I would mention, Rose, is that having the positions within the state agencies allows a ready template in terms of procurement processes, for example, that already require a lot of transparency. And that can be very appealing in terms of trying to meet objectives, being able to have some existing systems that can move either a grant program forward or a larger process or group such as the Massachusetts Food Policy Council.
Thank you. Thank you both. We have another question. This one's for Christina. The question is regarding the food trust. It seems as if you're able, it seems that you're using public dollars for private projects. Is that normally allowable in Massachusetts? In other states, bonds can only be exclusively used for public projects. So how are we able to do that?
Sure. So that's definitely something that we have been thinking about and been talking to the state agency on, HED. And that's why the model that this program is based off of and that has worked in other states is that it's not actually the state that's loaning out the dollars. It gets, it goes through that CDFI, the Community Development Financial Institution, and they have the ability to leverage the private capital and then to also loan and grant out those funds. But it can't actually go through HED. It'll go through another agency where the legal, I don't know exactly how to frame it, but it won't go through HED. It'll go through another state agency, and I'm happy to give a little bit more detailed information to whoever asked that question if you want to reach out to me offline. But it is possible in Massachusetts, but that is why we'll work with a CDFI.
And will you clarify what is HED?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development. So that's where the Mass Food Trust program lies.
Great. Thanks.
And it's a state agency that does have a seat on the Mass Food Policy Council.
Great. Thank you. Well, we are at time. We had some really great questions that were submitted, and we'll try and get responses out with the presentation slides and the recording to everyone that's attended and everyone that's registered. So if you ask a question, we'll try and get your answer after this presentation. We want to thank Doug, Mindy, Benita, Christina, and Rose for all being on the webinar this afternoon and imparting their wisdom and insights and experiences with us. We will send links to the NCSL report so you can find more information about other legislation that's been passed in states across the nation. And with that, we're going to conclude the webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you
very much
for having us.
Bye.